Kesubos Daf Gimel contains three sugas. We're going to start about a third of the way through the daf, having already seen the story in the top of the daf. The Gemara, in its first part, will be discussing Kesubos Binin and Dichron again. Here, the Gemara will be discussing what happens when a woman sells or is mochel. She waives the right to collect her ksuba. What happens to the Kesubos Binin and Dichron if she dies before her husband? The Gemara will then briefly talk about the obligation of a man to pay for the burial of his wife. Then the Gemara will get into the concept of Kesubos Binin Nokvin, which is the ksuba which is given the right, the Tanai ksuba, which is that the estate will support the daughter of a woman after the death of the husband, and the Gemara will discuss when the daughter loses that right because of her marriage. Is it from the time of Erisin or from the time of Nisun? So let's begin. Again, we're starting about a third of the way through the daf. The Gemara discusses what happens when a woman sells or is mochel her right to collect her ksuba. The Gemara's question will be, is there still a ksuba? The Gemara will ask about sale. The Gemara will ask about mochel. The Gemara will bring two people who discussed it, and then the Gemara will attempt to resolve the issue. So the Gemara first says that Rav Yemar Sava is the one who asked the question to Rav Nachman, and he asked about where she sells the ksuba, but she sells it to her husband. So to one's husband, she could sell the ksuba. She could also be mochel the ksuba. To somebody else, she can only sell the ksuba. So if she sells to her husband the ksuba, and she says, "I'm going to sell to you for less than the value of the ksuba itself. I'm going to sell you the right to collect the ksuba," which means that if the marriage dissolves before she dies, he will not have to pay the ksuba. So he's going to pay her now, let's say 150 zuz, for the right to not have to pay the 200 zuz if it ever becomes due and payable. So the question then is, if she then dies first, what happens to the ksuba that she was going to bequeath to her sons? As we've seen before, the halacha is that there's two types of property that the woman owns that she bequeaths to her sons after she dies, even though they really go to her husband. By Takanas Chazal, they go to her sons. What is that? That's the dowry that she got from her father when she got married, and the ksuba that her husband promised to her. Both of those things, if she dies first, her husband inherits her, but Chazal said it has to go to her sons. On the death of the husband, when the Yerusha is divided up, her sons get it. They don't have to share it with other sons that he has. Because the Gemara's question is, if she sold it to him, so maybe it's really his now. And if it's his now, then it's not. When he dies, it doesn't go to her sons as property, as her ksuba that's being divided up among her sons. It's really the husband's property now. He bought it. So perhaps then there is no Kesubos Binin Dichron, or perhaps there is. So the Gemara says, okay, that was the question. The Gemara says, why do you ask the question in the case where she sold it? Why don't you ask the question in the case where she was mochel it? She didn't take money for it. She waived the right to collect the ksuba. That means she gave it to her husband. She gave it back to her husband instead of selling it to him. So the Gemara says that perhaps the reason why we did not ask that is because that would be obvious once we answer this. When she sold it, so obviously she needed the money. She needed the money now. So it's much more of a svara to say she didn't really want to give up the ksuba, and it's still a right that she wanted to pass on to her sons, and therefore she should still get the right. She doesn't lose the right. We don't take it away from her. She needed the money. She was an onus almost. However, if she was just mochel it, she waived it. Obviously she didn't care about her sons, so she was mochel that right, and she gave up the right. Now, that's how it was presented up to now. The Gemara now says that Rava set it up in three different cases. He said if she sells it to other people, not to her husband, so then she clearly did it because she needed the money. She was not mochel the ksuba. And then if she dies first, so the ksuba is never collectible, the ksuba still goes to her sons as Kesubos Binin Dichron. There's never... Understand, it's not really a ksuba payment. If she dies first, really is no ksuba. It just means that the amount that was promised in the ksuba goes to her sons as an inheritance from her husband's estate. Now, so that's if she sells the right to collect the ksuba to somebody else, to a stranger, not to her husband. Now, if she's mochel it to her husband, opposite extreme, there she for sure doesn't get the ksuba to her sons, like we said before, because she obviously didn't care about her son's rights and she just gave up on it. The question is, what if she sells it to her husband? That's somewhat in between. So Rava asked the question, and Rava himself is the one who answered it, and Rava said it's the same as if she sells it to someone else, and there is a Kesubos Binin Dichron there. Now, the Gemara asks a kasha. The Gemara says, Rav Idi Bravin asks a kasha from a Mishnah in Yevamis. Yevamis talks about what happens if a woman's husband went to Medina Siyam, he didn't come back, witnesses came and said he died, she went and got remarried, and then the husband came back. So she's married to a new man, her old husband comes back, now she's married to two men. So what's she supposed to do here? So the law says she's usher to both of them. She doesn't get a ksuba from either of them. And it says that the sons, through neither of them inherit her ksuba. Someone says, what do you mean ksuba? She doesn't have a ksuba. Someone says, it's talking about ksuba has been in a different. It's talking about where she dies first. And the sons come to the father's estate and they say, we want our mother's ksuba. Not to actually collect the ksuba, but to get that amount from their father's estate without sharing it with other sons. And that we say there isn't any. That right is lost. So the Gemara's question is, if we say in where she needed money, we say that her son's right is still protected. It's not her fault she needed money. The Gemara even compares it as if she's being whipped with a leather strap with a steel ball on the end. It's really painful. She needs money. So if we say that she's an onus, she's considered there's nothing she could do about it, and the money where she needed the money, and therefore we say that her sons still get the rights. And certainly in the case where she got wrong testimony, or she was nisaveh, she really wanted to be married, so the shizanos there too. Why don't we say that the sons shouldn't lose their right to the ksubas, been in a different in that case as well? So that the Gemara answers that there's a special knas chazal against her. We want to make sure that she's going to be very careful before she gets remarried, and therefore we take away any rights she'll have if she ends up making the wrong decision. And that's why she will lose the ksuba from her sons if she goes ahead and gets remarried and it turns out to be wrong. Next, the Gemara discusses what happens if she's mochler ksuba. Does she still get mizonos? Does she still get support, which is part of the Tanoi Kesubos? So Gemara says that Rabban Bar Chanina sat in front of Rav Chizda, and he said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, she does not get mizonos because it's part of the Tanoi Kesuba. She was machal Kesuba, she doesn't get that. So he said, if not that you were a great person, I would say on you, Meishav Ra Tachas Tova Lo Tomash Rami Beso. Somebody who does good instead of bad will not end the bad in his own house, meaning that's a terrible thing to say. Next, the Gemara discusses what happens is the right of a woman to have her husband pay for her kvura, the funeral cost and the burial. So the Gemara says that the husband's payment for the ksuba is in exchange for his inheriting her nedunya, the dowry that she brings into the marriage. So the Gemara says that Rav Nachman and Ula and Avimi Bar Papi were sitting, and Rav Chia was sitting with them, and somebody came to them, and his wife, who was just an arusa, not a full wife, she was an arusa, had died. And they said to him, you have to bury her, or you give her the ksuba, that's the choice. Meaning to say that the obligation of the ksuba exists, and you have a choice. Either you pay the ksuba to her, and that meaning, well, she died, but you'll give that ksuba to her estate, and they will use that to bury her, or you go pay for the burial yourself. And that's because the burial is in exchange for what you get from her. So the Gemara says that Rav Chia said to them, didn't we learn that there is no obligation on an arusa? We learned that if somebody's wife is just an arusa, meaning they only have erison, so neither of them are an onain to each other, neither of them are allowed to be mitame to each other. If he's a kohen, he's not allowed to. If she is not obligated to. If she dies, he does not inherit her. He doesn't get any of the nedunya that she brought. It's if she dies. If he dies, she collects her ksuba. Now, the reason is if he dies, he collects the ksuba. That implies, though, that if she dies, she doesn't get the ksuba. Now, if she dies, the ksuba that she would get is referring to the burial obligation, that the husband has the right to pay for the burial in exchange for his nedunya. Here he didn't get the nedunya, and that's why the implication is that he doesn't get the burial. It's only if he dies that there's a ksuba. If she dies, there isn't one. So Gemara says, what's the reason? The reason is that the obligations of the ksuba that are written don't take effect. They don't take effect until Nisuin. And Nisuin didn't happen yet. It says Lechisha Tinosi. They didn't take effect, and therefore if she died at this point, it's not chal. Now the Gemara says that when Ravin came and said in the name of Rish Lakish that an arusa who dies does not get a ksuba, Abai said, big favor you did for us, take your favor and throw it on the thorns. We're already aware of that halacha because Rav Hoshia said it in Vavel, so we already know that. The Gemara now moves on to discuss the next part of the Mishnah, which is Kesubos Daf and Nokvan. That is where a man writes for his wife in the Kesuba that after he dies, he's going to support her daughter. Part of the estate will go to give a constant flow of upkeep and support for the woman's daughter. And that continues until a certain stage at which it's no longer their obligation. So the Gemara's question is, how long does that go? And the Gemara will ultimately boil down to what happens when she becomes an arusa. What happens when she's engaged? Does that take off the obligation of support from the estate of her father and put it on her husband or not? So the Gemara brings it as follows. The Gemara says that Rav says that it goes until she gets married. Levi says it goes until she becomes a bogeres, until she turns 12 and a half. So the Gemara says this is a machlokas, they don't agree with each other. These two things are both true. She gets married or she becomes 12 and a half. So the Gemara says, yes, it's true. They both hold of each other. It's not their argument. Their argument is what happens when she becomes an arusa. So when we say until she gets married, we mean until the time of marriage, meaning until the marriage is due. So when she's an arusa, and she's not a bogeres yet, that's the question. Does she get a mizonos then or not? Levi holds either one, until she becomes an arusa or until she becomes a bogeres. Either one stops the flow of mizonos. Rav says it's only when she becomes a marriage or a bogeres, not when she becomes an arusa. Now, the Gemara says also machlokas tanoim. Rabbi Elazar says when she becomes a bogeres. Tanna Kama says when she becomes an arusa. Meaning to say in machlokas whether or not being an arusa takes the chiyuv off. Now we have a statement from Rav Yosef, which is unclear. He says it's until the havyon, until they get married. Gemara says, does that mean eris and unasuin? Gemara says, teku, we don't know the answer to that. So Gemara, a question was asked from Rav Chizda to Rav Yosef, did you hear what Rav Yehuda holds? Does an arusa get mazonos or not? So the Gemara says that he didn't hear, but he answered based on logic. And the other one said, well, I could tell you a logical reason the other way. It's not sure who said which reason. So the two reasons are, logic, it would make sense that she should not get mazonos once she becomes an arusa, because the only reason she was getting mazonos is because her father logically does not want her to go having to collect. It's a bizon, it's a zilzal for her to collect. Once she becomes an arusa, her husband won't let her collect. Her husband will make sure to feed her, and therefore the father doesn't have to give her mazonos anymore. That's the argument to say that she shouldn't get the mazonos once she's an arusa. The argument to say the other way is that the husband's not going to support her, because the husband, as long as she's an arusa, the husband's not sure this marriage is going to work out. He may find a mum, he may break it, and therefore he doesn't want to give her any money if she's not going to end up being his wife. And therefore she should still be stuck on the support of her father's estate. Gemara now presents a series of 5 questions, cases in which there is no ksuba. Gemara wants to know, is there still this Tanai ksuba for the daughter? Possible that the din of the ksuba and the din of the Tanai ksuba are different. Gemara is going to present 3 of them on this daf, 2 more on the next daf. Before the Gemara begins, the Gemara gives a simin. The names of the people who asked the question are Sak Zaraf. The Rosh Tevis are Shin Kof Zayin Reish Fei. And the 5 questions are Ma'ana v'yibmo shnia, Arusa v'anusa. So question number 1 is about Miyana. So that's a girl who does Miyan. That is a Kitana who is married off by her father or her brother. It's only marriage to Rabbanon. She can walk out of the marriage and becomes uprooted retroactively. Question is, if that happens, is she still entitled to a mizonos, or do we say to support, or do we say that she uprooted the marriage, it's like she never was married in the first place? So Gemara says, Rav Sheshes says we learned the answer to this in the Mishnah. Mishnah brings what is meant to sound like a machlokas as to whether someone who leaves, who has her marriage ended, is she still entitled to mizonos? So it speaks about. So the Tanna Kama says an almana, a grusha, or a shomeres yavam, that's somebody whose husband died and she's waiting to marry his brother, and the din of yivam. All these 3, as long as they're in their father's house, they still get mizonos. Rav Yehuda says, anybody, as long as they're in the father's house, they get mizonos. Gemara says, these halachos are the same. What's the difference? Gemara says, the difference is a mimma enes. Because the Tanna Kama says a mimma enes is considered to be still someone who's married and go back to her father's house. So Yehuda says this is not called father's house. This is not called that she's still at father's house. She's on her own, and therefore she does not get mizonos. Next, the Gemara quotes the second question. This is asked by Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, what about the daughter of a Yavama? That's a woman who was married, she had no children. Then her husband dies, she falls to Yibum. She has a daughter with the second husband, with the Yavam. Now the halacha is that her ksuba is meant to be taken from her first husband's estate. Obviously, that estate doesn't have to pay mizonos to her daughter, because the daughter is not the daughter of that husband, it's the daughter of the second husband. Now, if there is no money in the first husband's estate, she can't collect the ksuba from the second husband, because from the yavam, because we do require that she should have a security. So the next question is, this Tanai ksuba, if she's collecting the ksuba from her first husband's estate, is there no ksuba for the daughter? Or do we say, and there's no ksuba from the second husband, because he doesn't have to give one in a case where there's money from the first one? Or do we say that because the second husband, the yavam, still functions as a backup ksuba, he's the one who should be giving ksuba to the daughter, because for that there is nobody else to give, and the Gemara leaves it as a teku question will stand. Gemara's third question and final one for this stuff is asked by Rav Elazar. What if somebody does an iser shnius la'arayis? He marries an iser de Rabbanon. The Rabbanon took his ksuba away. So the question is, there's no ksuba. Is there still a Tanai ksuba for the daughter? The daughter didn't do anything wrong. Why should she lose her Tanai ksuba? The mother, I understand, she did an iser, so she lost her ksuba, but perhaps the daughter does not, and the Gemara leaves that as teku as well.